Rich Klein, thank you for joining me on True 30 again, sir. It's great to have you
back, Joey.
Well, per our text this week, I sent you a note about how touched I was with the piece you wrote on July 17th on your Substack about David Gergen, and he passed away. So sorry for your loss there. I know he was a good friend and mentor for you. And this piece kind of discussed who he was as a human being and kind of the loss of civility and common sense in politics. And so I thought, why don't we tell me a little bit about your relationship with David for starters? I think my listeners would enjoy that. And for those who've been on the show, they know your background, but give us a little bit of time there too, specific to your time at as a reporter and then your tenure with David Gergen.
Sure, happy to. I met David, 21 years old, right out of college, hired for a 1-year fellowship. David was new as editor of U.S. News and World Report magazine. He had recently left the Reagan White House, had run a magazine at the American Enterprise Institute that kind of focused on polling and opinion data, and then took over at U.S. News. Back when you had 3 real news magazines in the U.S., you had Time, Newsweek, and U.S. News. They all kind of presented themselves a little bit differently. U.S. News was a little bit of the more conservative and maybe less flashy of the 3, but it had been around a long time and had a loyal following. And David was running the place, and they had this idea of bringing in young journalists for 1 year to work directly with the editor. And I was there for a year and asked to stay for a second year. And then after the second year, David asked me to stay on, and I was there almost 5 years. Formative years, right out of college, figuring out my career and figuring out Washington. And David was a natural teacher, something that he did a lot of later in life when he was a professor at Duke and at Harvard. But at that stage, he was a reformed White House official trying to understand the news environment, and so I just kind of had this seat at the table with somebody who had flown very high. He had been in the Nixon White House. Gerald Ford had kept him on. He was very influential with Ronald Reagan, and then. Later on, he joined the Clinton administration, which shocked people who didn't know David. But if you knew him, you knew firstly that he had a friendship with President Clinton that dated back to their crossing paths years earlier at the Renaissance Festival down in South Carolina. And you also knew that David was the kind of person who was wired that when the president calls, you say yes. Mm-hmm. It doesn't really matter what they're asking. If the president needs you, it is in the national interest and the public interest to serve. And so I had a seat at the table with somebody who, they were turbulent times. We went through Iran-Contra. Mikhail Gorbachev reached the head of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union and slowly began to turn the battleship, and Reagan started to see him somewhat differently from his predecessors. We had Tiananmen Square. There was a lot of upheaval, and I watched how David kind of respected everybody's point of view and listened and wanted to understand and wanted to not alienate or exile people, but to find a center of gravity where you could have a respectful, honest, opinionated conversation and maybe come away understanding each other better, a little bit better informed yourself, and finding a way to solve a problem that everybody thought was okay. If somebody was overly happy, it means it wasn't a good deal. You needed everybody to be okay and maybe a little frustrated and a little disappointed, and then we probably got it right. And I learned by watching, and I learned by the power of his example. And so I have never had any presence on social media ever. I have never had Facebook or Instagram or MySpace, anything. And I started that Substack so that I could share my affection for and respect for and admiration for David. And so I guess if it could push me to finally break the seal, it says something about my feelings for him and his presence here in Washington.
Yeah, I mean, our first interview, which was a couple years ago now, you spoke kindly of him then on camera about your relationship and his mentorship and how important it was for you, and kind of the life lessons that he taught you outside of the political. And one you did share in your piece, I think, is worthwhile, specific to him writing, asking you if you knew of this mother and her son, specific to the Iraq War. You want to reveal that piece?
This was late summer, early fall, 1990. So Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait, and President George H.W. Bush had rolled out Operation Desert Shield, which was a massive military buildup, multinational force in the Saudi desert on the Kuwaiti border, ideally to show the Iraqi leader that we were serious, that the whole world was serious, and that it would be in his best interests to withdraw. And if he refused, to be positioned for combat. And so this buildup is happening every day. Thousands of U.S. troops are deploying to Saudi Arabia. I mean, you may remember the aerial footage of miles of jeeps lined up and miles of armor lined up and miles of tents that were being put up. It was a massive show of force.
Mm-hmm.
And David was writing the U.S. News editorial, which always appeared on the back page of the magazine, and decided if he wants to kind of understand and explain Desert Shield and where it might lead to and what the possibilities and the probabilities of combat were, that he should go talk to the people doing the war planning. And given his tenure in the Nixon and Ford and Reagan White Houses, he had relationships with Jim Baker, who then was Secretary of State. David had worked for when he was White House Chief of Staff. Brent Scowcroft, who was National Security Advisor and former Deputy Secretary of State under Henry Kissinger, and Dick Cheney, who was Secretary of Defense.
Mm-hmm.
David reaches out. All three say, yes, we'll come see me. Let's talk. But the magazine is on a Friday deadline, a Friday night deadline, so that it can be, all the writing can be closed. The art department can do its work. It can be laid out, sent to print, the hard copy printed, delivered for postal services, and it can wind up in people's hands on Monday. So we're on a Friday night deadline. And of course, all three of these conversations are scheduled for a Friday afternoon. And David is gone for hours. And the magazine is moving forward, but we need the back page editorial. And this is before cell phones. There's no way to reach him. There's no way to know where he is.
Right.
And slowly there's kind of this alarm building in the magazine, from the art department to the accounts that are worried about overruns, and it's going to cost more if we go to print too late. Everybody's waiting. Everybody's anxious. And David finally gets back to the office around 3:30, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We don't have a lot of time. I mean, the clock's almost at zero. And he goes into his office. He closes the door. And 5 minutes later, this really lovely woman who was the switchboard operator at the magazine comes up, very, very nervous. She says, Mr. Gergen asked me to come see him. And she goes into his office, closes the door. She's in there for about a half hour. And now, in terms of magazine production, it's getting to be a panic.
Yeah, you guys are freaking out.
Nobody knows. I mean, he hasn't written anything.
Yeah.
And she comes out, and I don't really remember the expression on her face. She leaves, walk into his office. I said, we don't have a lot of time. I don't know what's going on, but we're almost past deadline. And he says to me, Richard, do you know that her son is in the U.S. Army? And I didn't. He says, and he's being deployed to Saudi Arabia. And she's scared. She's terrified. The news at that point, as the buildup was happening, I remember there were news stories about the Pentagon ordering 250,000 body bags, and we were going to be facing an Iraqi military of 1 million soldiers that was battle tested after 8 years of brutal combat with Iran. So the expectations were this was going to get very, very ugly. And David says she's terrified. She's listening to the news. She hears what's going on. I wanted her to know what I just learned. I wanted to share with her what I know, because the White House is worst case scenario setting.
Yeah.
But the intelligence is somewhat different. The expectations are different, but they're not saying it publicly. And I didn't want her to worry, and I wanted her to know to come see me. And that was pretty humbling. And he got to writing and banged out the editorial, and off it went. And he said, her son's going to war. And I know things that maybe make her feel better. And I wanted her to be aware of that. And I'll never forget that, because I thought, here is somebody who just got, at the lowest end, a background briefing, and probably more like a classified briefing, from the three men that are setting the stage for this country to go to war. And his first thought was, how do I make the mother of a soldier feel a little bit better and worry a little bit less? That sticks with you. You just realize that, especially in Washington, where proximity to power comes with an awful big ego boost, and people forget maybe the steps that led them there. And David did not view it that way. He viewed it always as a privilege, and he thought that the best thing he could do was help somebody else worry less. And you got to love a guy like that, and you have to be sorry there aren't more like him.
Well, and that's kind of where we started getting on the idea of common sense and civility within our government today. And one of our discussions that we've had on camera over the last couple of years was, we talked specifically, because my background in media and your background as a speechwriter, about the Democrats losing the narrative, specifically losing the working class, right? They just didn't cater to them, neither in their messaging or their marketing or their overall intent. And I think that's why they lost a lot of the folks. And that's a previous article. But I broached that subject because, today, with the death of common sense, I think we just talked a little bit about my trip back to Minnesota,
right,
off camera. And I was there. I grew up in Rochester, Minnesota, but a lot of my relatives are in rural Minnesota. And Rochester itself and Minnesota itself is a blue state historically. But my relatives, who I dearly love, most of which are Trump supporters. And most of my friends from high school here, about 50 miles north of San Francisco, are also Trump supporters. And I haven't lost a friendship over this. We've had numerous discussions. They know that I report on politics. So they do ask me questions here and there. They send me emails here and there. But being home I've been home twice in the last 3 months to help my mom. And they asked me questions previous to the election about Mr. Trump and what I thought he was going to do, and specific to policies and Medicare and farming and tariffs and all the things that he promised to do in Project 2025. And it was one of those things where I explained to them with as much wisdom and compassion as I could, here's what I think he's going to do. It doesn't mean he will, but if you look at this document, it's 800 pages of kind of a go-to-market strategy. Here's what we're going to do in the next administration. And in 2017, a lot of my friends and family in Minnesota and some here are farmers. And so it was one of those things where they got hit in 2017 with some of the issues around Trump's attacks on farms and tariffs and things like that. And so when the tariffs from Canada in this administration were launched, and he put tariffs on Canada for 25%, most potash, which is fertilizer that you need to plant your stuff, has a 25% tariff on it today. And that's hurting my friends and relatives in Minnesota. And so they call me and ask me questions about that. And I share that with you because the civility within my relatives and my friends is there, right? I love them. I think that the news media that they choose to watch, and the fact that some of them have 2 and 3 jobs and don't spend a lot of time triangulating sources and trying to figure out what's going on out there. It's complicated to actually know what's going on. But they're moving forward. And I had a guest on recently who I really liked on the show. And when I see his social media, I don't know who that person is anymore. Because what he was on camera and what he was and what he is.
Well, we see that everywhere, right? I mean, my daughter's 22, my son is 20. I can remember, 10 years ago, them showing me what their friends would put on social media, and that anonymity of typing and not looking at somebody in the face is awful. And it takes away a sense of shame, and it takes away a knowledge of hurting somebody. And as you get older, if you've bought into that, you post away, and you kind of think that it's lighting a fuse and then not caring what happens.
Yeah, and it was what I think it was that same discussion that we had. You told me that the next Democratic candidate at a national level that's going to have a chance of winning needs to say something to the effect is that I understand why you voted for Mr. Trump.
Well, so two things at work here. One is to your point a moment ago. The country's become so siloed. We have different facts. We have different realities. I mean, rural America and urban America have always had different issues, different challenges, different priorities.
Yeah.
But I think the elimination of the fairness doctrine in the Reagan administration has had lasting negative effects. The theory used to be that airwaves are public space. And in order to qualify to have a broadcast license, you needed to treat the airwaves as a public forum, and you needed to give time to multiple sides of the same issue. Saturday Night Live famously mocked it in their point counterpoint with Dan Aykroyd and Jane Curtin, and his famous "Jane, you ignorant slut" line. But back in the 70s and early 80s, I mean, network news gave time to different points of view, briefly, factually. The elimination of the fairness doctrine has then led to news being a commodity that is there for a profit and for ideological purposes and not necessarily informational purposes. Yep. And it has led to this tribalism where we hear different things, and we all have different facts, and we can't have a civil conversation about the same thing. What you're able to do when you go home to Minnesota is you're willing to listen. Mm-hmm. And if you are willing to listen, then you have to hope that the people on the other end of the conversation will then listen to your point of view. And you usually realize that we're not that far off on ideas. Right. We all want the same thing. I mean, we all want good schools and safe streets and clean water and clean air and a good future for our kids. And we all want these things. And we can debate on how to get there.
Yep.
And that's okay. But I think the elimination of the fairness doctrine, and then the idea that news departments had to turn a profit. There's an old story. I've read it more than a few times, so I kind of think it's probably true, which is Bill Paley used to run CBS Network. And at the end of each year, he would kind of bring his department heads together, review the year, and talk about their budget for the following year and what was expected. And Marvin Kalb was running the news bureau. And Paley tells Kalb, we're going to expand your budget. Keep doing what you're doing. And Kalb quietly says to his boss, I don't know if we can, I appreciate it. I can use the added budget resources, but I don't know if we can turn a profit spending this much. And Bill Paley famously says to Marvin Kalb, I have Jack Benny to make me money. You make us smarter and you make us look good. And that used to be the role of your news department. That was about our credibility. That was about our place in the community. That was about our values.
Yeah.
We can hire people to make audiences laugh and entertain them, and we'll sell ads and we'll make money there. You are about our rep, and those days are gone. That famous spot where Jon Stewart is on Crossfire with Tucker Carlson and Paul Begala and is begging them to stop what they're doing because it's bad for the country.
Yep.
he wasn't wrong, and it applies more so today. So I think that's a big part of it. But the other thing is, I would like to see a Democrat give a speech that says, I understand why people voted and vote for Donald Trump. In America today, if you do not have a lobbyist or a trade association or a PAC making campaign contributions, you do not have a voice. And that harsh truth is why so many people are so angry, because they look at what's coming out of Washington from both parties, and they don't understand where they are in their elected leaders' calculations. And we've seen it just in the last 3 weeks. The numbers of people who are going to lose coverage on Medicaid, I don't care whose numbers you believe, none of it is zero. There are an awful lot of people who are going to lose their coverage. You talk to farmers who suddenly are talking about how the workers who are in their fields are not showing up for work, are scared to come out for work. They've got more and more of their crops that are not being harvested on time or may rot in the fields. Yeah. Eventually, that adds to food price inflation, and we're all going to feel that.
Yeah. And bankruptcies of farms. Right. That's another thing that they're not talking about, because the bailout in 2017, I think, was 28 or 38 billion, if memory serves.
I think it was
38 billion. And so you look at that and go, well, it seems like a small number because the numbers don't mean anything anymore. We have these 100 billion here and a trillion here, but $38 billion is not a small sum of money, right? I mean,
even more so when you talk about family farms.
Yeah. And that was something that he caused. And then everyone's, oh, he saved us. And it's like, well, that's like giving the arsonist credit.
Exactly.
The fire out. So
so here we are in this environment, in this moment where people their voices are not being heard in Washington. There are policies that just simply don't make sense for the national interest.
Right.
You want to talk about eliminating USAID, all that aid that gets shipped all over the world, food aid, that's food that's bought from American farmers. That's right. Wheat and corn and flour that are bought from American farmers and are sent to refugee camps in Africa and famine and war victims. Now, the fact that package had a nice American flag on it is good for the U.S. globally. It is good for our standing in the world. But the fact that the government is buying this from American farmers to fill the pipeline of aid, farmers are eventually going to feel the loss of those sales. There's no way around it.
Well, soybean sales, I was telling this to my buddy who's a farmer in the Midwest, and it's 53% of soybeans are sold to China. So you look at that, and because we don't have a big enough market for all the soybeans and corn and everything that we grow here in the States. And so that's, if they're not exporting, then where's the market? And if there's no market, obviously that affects prices too on supply and demand, just basic economics.
Right. So I get why people are so angry. But they should be angry at both parties.
Yeah.
Both parties are addicted to lobbyists and special interest money. I mean, I had flirted with this idea with a couple of friends of launching a project that would say, we will fund any campaign, state or federal, in full, to any candidate who forswears taking any money from PACs, lobbyists, or special interests. There's got to be a formula that says you have X number of voters. This is the cost of a Y minute of prime advertising time. Campaign season is Z days. We will write you a check for however many million, and your only obligation is to act in the best interest of your voters, not the way an oil and gas lobbyist or an airline industry lobbyist tells you to vote. And I thought, do we think if we launched that, we could get 50 million people to donate $20 each? That's $1 billion.
Yeah.
That might not pay for presidential campaigns. It would pay for pretty much every...
It would pay for congressional campaigns.
It would pay for every House and Senate race.
You correct me if I'm wrong. I've read different pieces on this, but the congressional candidates, our representatives, have 2-year terms, and I've read that they spend up to 70% of their time fundraising.
I have had conversations with members of Congress who tell me that they have to raise $25,000 a day
Every day.
from the moment they take office in
Okay.
order to fund their next campaign. I don't know if it's still there. When I worked in the Senate a few years ago, you had the Hart Senate office building, and then across the street was an office building, a private office building that had been carved up into small little kind of one office suites. And senators would walk across the street. They were renting these little offices, and they would spend a couple of hours a day making calls from there to raise money, because federal law doesn't allow them to raise money from their offices. They cannot sit at their desk in the Hart building or the Dirksen building or the Russell building. They cannot sit at their desk and call a donor and ask them if they're going to, do what they did this election cycle as they did last time. So they walk across the street with somebody from their campaign, and they have a call list, and they've got 2 or 3 hours, and they call, and walk back to the office. They do that every day.
Every day.
Every day.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a part of it. Obviously, the money's a part of the problem. But another thing I wanted to get your opinion on, specific to understanding the body politic a little bit, is that per my share with you on Minnesota, I don't think our politicians understand who they represent anymore. I don't think they know enough, because they listen to polls.
Yep.
They listen to data scientists. They listen to all the folks that are in the know, but they're again, I think it's all, and I don't blame the scientists or the pollsters anymore. In part, I blame the fact that people just don't feel that they can be honest, right? About who they believe and why they believe certain things, because they think they feel judged and weird. And it was kind of like the difference between what people say online and what they say offline when you interview them.
Right.
And you mentioned in your piece, it was called Listen, Listen, Listen. And this was David's advice to listen to local AM radio when you drive, because it was a great way to understand what was happening in America from the inside out in each locale, which I thought was super cool. Same piece, or the same paragraph, you talked specifically about Nixon's White House, where there's a pollster named Al Sindlinger in Media, Pennsylvania, who had a very unique way of gauging opinions in America. I want you to share that story, because I loved it, in the sense that, as someone who spent a lot of time in advertising in media, I've never seen this approach. It seems atavistic, specific to the lack of technology, but I think that the data that comes from it is even more necessary today than ever.
Well, it was a small talk moment. I had mentioned I was taking a road trip. I was going down to the Outer Banks of North Carolina, and David asked me what I listen to when I'm on a long drive. And I had just gotten a couple of new tapes from dead shows in Alpine Valley, Wisconsin. And he said, listen to AM talk radio when you're in the car. He said, it's a great way to understand authentically what people are thinking about and caring about and worrying about, community to community, location to location. And I did that. And some of it was amusing, some of it was insightful and interesting, and some of it was frightening. There were some crazy Aryan nations, far right people calling into talk shows. But it was he was right. I mean, it was a fascinating way to get out of your comfort zone and hear what was happening in people's lives outside of where you lived and who you socialized with. And when I came back, I told him that, and he told me a story that this pollster, Al Sindlinger, didn't ask people yes, no, agree, disagree, strongly, or whatever it was.
Right.
He would kind of, in the late dinner hour, so that he had a better chance of reaching people at home, he would randomly pull phone books. He had a massive library of phone books from all over the country, and they would just randomly pull them down, flip open a page, almost. I mean, I'm somewhat speculating here, but he would just randomly put his finger on a name, call. If they answered, he would introduce himself, and he would spend a little bit of time just talking. How are things in your community? What's going on? What do you and your neighbors talk about? What worries you? What keeps you up at night? What feels like it's going well? What do you think is happening in your future? And he would take reams and reams of notes and then type up these long reports that were essentially capturing the mood of the country, not in data and
Right.
not in numbers, but in actually talking and listening to people. He did not know, by the way. I mean, I suspect that the phone book itself might have told you if you were in a rural, suburban, or urban area, and maybe what the racial makeup of that area was. But he could not tell you if the person he was choosing to call, what their age was, what their race was, what their religion was, what their party feeling. He didn't know. He just randomly picking somebody off a page. But he would do this with enough diversity, enough randomness, that he would come away with a sense for what the country is feeling and thinking. And he would write these long reports. Sometimes they were for politicians, sometimes they were for companies and brands, what people thought. And Nixon was fascinated by it and would occasionally ask David to drive up to Pennsylvania and sit on an extension in another room and just listen and take notes and come back and tell the president, here's what the country is thinking and how they're feeling. And it's kind of remarkable. You watch especially in the lead up to election, you see all of this polling data and it's all numbers, but it doesn't really tell us the heart and soul of the mood of the country. I mean, the last election is probably the perfect example. The last 3 elections, the pollsters really were not right. And they can try to rationalize it all they want. I mean, I've heard stories about, polls that only use cell phones and not landlines, so they're not capturing potential voters over the age of 40 something. And their sample sizes are too small. And, you had famously, right, the pollster in Iowa who days before and was astronomically wrong.
Yes, he was way off.
Trying to force people into neat boxes and trying to capture what is happening in the country by numbers. I don't think it does anybody any good. And to your point a moment ago, it would be much better if these members of Congress actually stopped and listened, and not in these big town hall meetings, but in the old retail politics of having your constituents bump into you in the grocery store. The problem is these guys don't go home as much as they used to. They're here in Washington, so much more. And when they are home, they're giving their time because they need to raise money. They're giving their time to donors.
And that's kind of the problem too, because I think that's where they lose touch with America in the grand sense. So, as I mentioned, I grew up poor, single mom, and so when I go back to visit, I have a lot of nostalgia tied to the neighborhood in which I used to live in. And because my mom's 85, I spend a lot of my time with her now, taking her back and forth to doctor's appointments. She has different maladies, diabetic related, eye vision problems, high blood pressure, arthritis, just that stuff. And so you spend a lot of time in between those hospital visits, walking in and out and seeing Americans. And then my mom, because she's still very frugal, if she wants to wash a bedspread, we go to a local laundromat.
Right.
And we wash a big bedspread because she doesn't want to ruin her little washer dryer in her senior unit. And we talk to the people there. And then, my mom likes to visit people in hospice, and she likes to visit older folks who are lonely. I mean, she's awesome. I don't mean this is to glaze my mother, but it's one of those things where I, as someone who is writing and reading and reporting on politics, am fascinated by these. It's like back in my media days, we would do, qualitative studies where we'd interview 11 people and we'd do it deeply, right? It wasn't like we would just do quantitative where you have all these numbers and metrics and data and psychographic and ethnographic, all the different data points. It was actually going and talking to these folks, as opposed to, any politician. I don't mean to sort out anybody, but it was like J.D. Vance going to a donut shop with a camera crew. And he was so uncomfortable with the crew that he couldn't even admit that he liked donuts. I mean, it was so awkward and so wooden.
There's no authenticity.
No, there's nothing there. And a lot of folks decide they want to go to a Waffle House because they think that's where America is. And you're like, yeah, that's piece of America. But if you went to a local laundromat, if you went to visit a hospice unit, if you went to a Walmart, if you went to, just go to different places and parts within rural America and talk to these folks. Most of my friends and relatives in Minnesota are proud Trump supporters. a little bit of that has diminished. As I shared with you off camera,
Yeah.
with this last visit I came back, a lot of them are scared. It's specific about their Medicare, about the potash tariffs, about tariffs in general, about the ICE raids they think are going a little bit overboard. Even the Republicans on my family believe all this. But the reason I share that with you is because I think part of the reason that common sense needs to be reintroduced into politics is that we've lost the Al Sindlingers of the world to pollsters and to actual attempting, to the woman in Iowa, attempting to put people in these little buckets, and they're just not there. The amount of commonality I have with my relatives, even talking about tariffs, most of my relatives are tradesmen, electricians, plumbers, heating, air conditioning, construction, hardworking men and women who are conservative historically, more Mitt Romney conservative than they are MAGA. But they do believe that Trump serves them, that he cares about them based on his stories, right?
Well, but now I think this leads back to something we talked about a few moments ago, which is the family that you're visiting, the community that you're returning to. I'm guessing that uniformly they get their news from the same source.
Yes. Most of them get it from Fox or Newsmax or, any right-wing publication.
Which brings me back to fairness doctrine and giving multiple sides. One thing that I find fascinating is in a crisis moment, not CNN's overuse of the term breaking news 35 times a day, but an actual crisis moment.
Yeah.
The flip between Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, and see how they are covering it or presenting it.
Yeah.
And the most glaring example for me was when CNN immediately broke the coverage that the FBI had raided Trump's club in Florida with a warrant searching for classified documents that were missing.
Yeah.
That's a big story.
Yeah.
I flip over to Fox, they're not even covering it.
Right.
They actually at that moment were covering a story about China.
Okay.
And I'm watching, I'm waiting for them to cut away. And 2 minutes becomes 5 minutes, becomes 8 minutes, and they're not covering it.
No.
And so that goes back to this, we live in alternate realities. And we all watch the news that, we stay in our feedback loop.
Yeah.
And so when you're breaking through that cycle, when you're sitting in that laundromat or with your mom's neighbors and listening and talking to them face to face, rationally, calmly, not belittling them and not forcing your ideas down their throat. Now you're having a dialogue. Now that's democracy at work. I mean, my dad, years ago, grew up in the Week Wake section of Newark, got drafted, got sent out to Fort Benning, Georgia for basic training. And he talks about getting jumped and beaten up in the shower by guys who wanted to find if he had horns on his head as a Jew.
Okay.
But he also talks about sharing a barracks with a kid from Kentucky coal country and from inner city Chicago, guys who are very different from him, who he learned from and learned from him. And then you go on into life after you've done your service, and it's awfully hard to stereotype other people, and it's awfully hard to pigeonhole and kind of cut and file away people based on their demographics.
Yeah.
And when I worked in the Senate, it was something like between 75 and 80% of members of Congress had military service, and now it's about 20%.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that we should reinstitute a draft and military service should be required, but there's got to be a way to reintroduce a center of gravity that teaches people there's national interest and then there's personal interest. And that, by the way, David, later on in his career, he launched something called the Center for Public Leadership at Harvard, which brought in people left, right, and center, young people early in their careers to teach them about the responsibilities of being a leader in public service through the history of roles in government and the ways that you can impact people's lives. And if anybody right now just goes and does a search about David, you will find that the Kennedy School at Harvard and numbers of his students have written, and they're Republicans and they're Democrats and they're in Congress and they're in their state legislatures and they're volunteering and they're running, not whatever it is. But David was a believer in the public part of public service.
Do you think there's something, I mean, the old Tennessee Valley Authority and the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and things like that during the Roosevelt administration, did that also bring, do you think, people closer together, whether they were?
Oh, absolutely. You go back and you read some of the history about people who are suddenly, they're living in a work camp and they're, building the Appalachian Trail.
Yeah.
But they're also getting 3 meals a day in a country that's hungry in a lot of places. They're getting paid. They are now doing real work. And what that does for their psyche.
Yeah.
Absolutely. One of the sadly lesser visited and appreciated memorials here in Washington is the Franklin Roosevelt Memorial. It's really spectacular. It's open air. It kind of weaves, I think it's 11 acres in all. And it uses water and it uses sculptures to tell the story of America in Roosevelt's time in the White House. And so, like during the war years, you've got jagged, violent waterfalls, and then when World War II is coming to a close, it starts to settle. But there's a really wonderful statue of a husband and wife. The wife is sitting in a plain wicker chair. The husband is behind her with his hands on the rail, and they're sitting in front of their radio. And these were FDR's famous fireside chats.
Yeah.
And I'm there, and there's a grandmother with her grandson, and she says, "I remember this. I remember stopping and my family putting on the president and listening to him on the radio, and I remember knowing things are going to be okay. We were hungry. The depression was happening. We were scared, but the president we believed we were going to be okay." We don't get those moments anymore. We don't get those, again, that center of gravity that all of our lives, as different as they all intersect. And I think we're the worse off for it.
I think so too. And I think that specifically, you mentioned this with, a couple magazines, Time Magazine and U.S. World Report, and a couple other major publications. It's the same back then with CBS, NBC, and ABC. And so they didn't have a lot of networks. Walter Cronkite, obviously, being one of those calm voices for the American public about where we are. And if he said something, most people believed it. Today, to your earlier point, most of my relatives listen to Fox News and or conservative radio. And so they hear a lot of the same stuff, which is obviously different than the stuff that you'll hear if you listen to NPR or pay a lot of time to MSNBC. They are different narratives and there are different twists on the stories. And that's just part of it. I don't know if you know who, there's a book called Nexus by Yuval Harari.
I don't know.
Fantastic book. And he talks about the intersubjective nature of truth today, which was a really cool way to look at it. And what he talked about, and it gave a great example of, if I'm reporting on a war and there's, 10,000 soldiers, and I talk about the might and right and what's going to happen with these 10,000 soldiers, but I omit the fact that 9,000 of them were recruited on Tuesday, right? So they've never had any training and they have no understanding of war and they don't understand their weapons. And they're going up against 1,000 people that are analogous to Sparta, right? Yeah. There's some intersubjective truth to what you're saying and what your responsibility is to say, if you're telling the story. And I think there's what I loved about that, because it encapsulated a lot of the problems we're talking about. What Fox will do, they won't even air the story. But if they did air the story,
how would they present it?
How would they present it? And what facts would they show specifically?
Well, the use of the word facts, that's what's so interesting and so important. I actually, for the last few years, have advised people to turn off Fox and CNN and MSNBC. And you know what? Go watch the 24-minute nightly network news.
Yeah.
ABC World News Tonight, NBC Nightly
That's your whole,
News.
yeah.
24 minutes. It's just who, what, where, when.
It's real news.
No why.
Yeah. Right.
There's nobody coming on there reading talking points from a campaign or a party.
Right.
It is literally a summary of the events of the day. Now, for some weird reason, all three networks have obsessions with airplane and airline problems and sharks. So every night you're going to get one story about, I'd almost laugh at it, but there'll be one story about a small commuter plane that had to make an emergency landing because somebody smelled smoke.
Right.
I don't know if that's really national news. And if sharks are anywhere near Jones Beach in New York, it's national
It's
news.
everywhere. Yeah.
But other than that, other than the shark and airline fetish, it's really a pretty responsible, simple, clean, factual recitation of the events of the day. Everything else is just spin and propaganda and opinion baiting. And part of the obsession with or addiction to, again, Fox or CNN or MSNBC, we kind of outsourced our critical thinking.
Yeah.
And that, I think, literally, I think people don't analyze situations for themselves. They simply kind of fall into the propaganda hole and are spoon-fed and believe it and go. And don't stop to step back and think critically and make their own decisions and reach their own opinions.
I agree there. And I also think, I touched on this earlier, but I think a part of it specific to my upbringing was that people don't have time.
Yeah.
If you have, like, my mom's a single mom with 3 boys. I have 2 boys and a wife. So
yes.
I have, we're in a one-on-one defense, right? As opposed to my mom was in a zone defense her whole life, right? Trying to figure that out. And, she was a maid and she had odd jobs. And it was one of those things where she did the best she could, but she didn't have any, time to not only look at a story, but in today's media and today's political news, if you read a story, you have to triangulate the story.
Well, and it's, look,
you don't know.
Well, your mom is working long hours, and when she's off of work, she's chasing 3 boys.
And making us sit down and eat and trying to get us in the bath. Exactly.
Her phone was not pinging 7 times an hour with some headline.
Right.
9 out of 10 of which had no relevance to her life.
Exactly.
She didn't need to know. It didn't matter. She shouldn't care.
No.
But it's almost inescapable. I mean, we're all force fed this flow of information, whether we want it or not.
Yeah. Well,
my 20-year-old son had a couple of his high school buddies over the other day, and he said, "Is it true that Ghislaine Maxwell worked for the Mossad?" And I said, "Liam, where did you hear this?" "Well, my friend Vaughn heard it, and he's telling people
on TikTok."
Yeah. Ghislaine Maxwell's father, Robert Maxwell, who died accidentally, most likely was a source for the Mossad. It seems pretty well established that Robert Maxwell used his international travel as cover to observe and surveil and report back and share information with Mossad. But you take that nugget of truth and now you're extrapolating it into Ghislaine Maxwell was in the Mossad, and Jeffrey Epstein is an Israeli intelligence asset, and Tucker Carlson is off there selling this idea that Epstein was a Mossad agent who was blackmailing American politicians to be pro-Israel. I mean, where does this, there's one nugget of fact, and then the ripple from that thrown into the water goes really far.
Well, an example then, because these are educated young men, and they're asking you.
They're all college students. They're all going into their junior year of college.
Yeah.
What I liked was that my son was sharp enough to be skeptical.
Yeah.
Appreciated the fact check and went back and said, "Well, here's another perspective on that.
Right.
You should probably read up a little bit before you start talking about it."
Right. Now that's great. I think that's really the the common sense of what you've been talking about, and that's why I wanted to bring you back on camera, is that I think that we have, as a group, lost common sense, and that does apply to everyone in politics. It's not specific to the Democrats or the Republicans or the Independents or the moderates. It's that the common sense side of it is that if you do hear a story like that, I teach my kids that. They're 11 and 13, and my little boy uses the word all the time now. I said, if your buddies tell you something, say this, because it'll screw them up. Say, I find that dubious. Right. and my 11-year-old loves to say that now, because and we're going through all these vocabulary words for their high school test soon. And so that's a word that came up, and he's like, I know what that word is, Daddy. But I said, you want to ask, and you don't want to tell people like they're wrong. Ask them questions. Yeah. If someone says, there was a wave that was 3,000 feet high that hit Florida, I'd say, well, I find that dubious. Where did you get that? Where did you hear the story? And then I said, that's about as far as you have to ask your 11-year-old buddies, because they don't know. Right.
Well,
they usually don't know, or they heard it, or they saw it.
We live in an environment right now where apparently fact checking is not allowed.
Yeah.
Because we have a president who resents it.
Yeah.
But also, and Arnold Schwarzenegger has been talking about this for years, which is pendulum swing. And it would be really in the national interest and in our best interest if our political leaders kind of understood that they'll be on the other side of these debates and the other side of these majorities, not too long.
Yeah.
Harry Reid invoked the nuclear option in the Senate for confirmations, basically undid the 60 vote threshold to approve a nomination, because Republicans wouldn't approve any of Obama's nominees.
Yeah.
And then Republicans took it a step further and said, fine, then we're going to apply it to Supreme Court nominees, which had never been. And Schwarzenegger's point is all of these changes in rules when you're in the majority, they get used against you when you're in the minority. And by the way, can we please and this is Schwarzenegger, can we please get rid of executive orders, which just swing the pendulum to one extreme, and then when the next guy comes into office, he reverses it all. And business in America, and anybody who's doing financial planning and budgeting and long-range strategy, we need some stability and some certainty. That is the smartest way to plan your business, to plan your expansion, your investments, to plan your family. And yet this wild swing of absolutism and zero-sum politics is awful for the country.
It is. It is. What you need to do, Rich, I think the remedy is what you talked about, which I did not know until this chat, is that you need to launch this party where you can put a congressional candidate together.
The party, it's basically going back to publicly funded elections.
Yeah.
The worst thing that has happened in America, in the last 20 years is Citizens United.
I agree, 100%.
Which, this idea that corporations are people and campaign contributions are free speech, all that has done is tilted. Again, this goes back to, if you don't have a lobby and you don't have you don't have a voice.
No voice.
Well, I'm sorry, but my neighbors, God bless them, with their $200 campaign contributions, are not going to get the attention of a member who's taking $25,000 multiple times a year from a big corporation.
Right.
Or dark money that has no limits on it, and that can run all of those ads that run nonstop for a year before Election Day, and nobody's fact checking them. There's nothing that verifies whether what they're saying is true.
Or buying $1 million worth of meme coin.
Right.
To get a dinner with the president. Yeah, no, it is one of those things. I don't know exactly how hard it would be to launch that, but that is a way in which, because the one thing that I think a lot of people, good people, that would want to run as a civil servant, as a congressional representative, is that they don't want to spend whatever amount of their time. I've read anywhere between 60 and 70% of their time fundraising. That's not what they want to do if they actually want to be in civil service. They want to go
if they're there for the right reasons.
Yeah. Who wants to sit and raise money?
You need a whole bunch of ethics changes. The insider trading rules and the financial disclosure rules. I mean, it is alarming, the number of people who come to Washington in elected office and leave much richer than they got here. And I'm not accusing them. Most of them.
Yeah.
I'm not accusing everybody of being corrupt, but
No.
there's that doesn't feel right, and that should not be. I just had lunch today with the former Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs, so the top State Department official covering the North Africa and the Middle East, and she was talking about all of these people who have lost their jobs at the State Department, and she said, the expertise, the connectivity, the people in foreign governments who they work closely with.
Yeah.
There's the knowledge that we're losing because these people were given less than a day. They were given 5 hours to pack up and leave their offices.
5 hours.
The country cannot be the better or the safer or the more secure because thousands of diplomats were told to pack up and get out on 5 hours notice. It is, it is a very interconnected world. We buy and sell everywhere. We need parts and raw materials from everywhere. American farmers sell more overseas. American studios make more money with audiences overseas. The idea that we can pull up the drawbridge and be fine is just not true. President Clinton used to have this great riff. Why should we care about what's happening in other places? And he would say, why should we care about HIV and AIDS in Haiti? Because they're Haitian refugees. No matter what the Coast Guard is doing, their boats are going to wash up on land in South Florida. They're going to make their way into communities in Florida. And if they have HIV/AIDS, it's going to spread. Why should we care about Chinese energy policy? Because all that coal that they're burning becomes our acid rain, back when that was the term of abuse. And that's what destroys our lakes and destroys our forests. And we have to care what's happening in other countries because eventually it comes home here. We saw it with COVID. You cannot hermetically seal this country. I mean, unless you want to be North Korea.
No, and that's another discussion I had with my cousins specific to, tariffs and deficits. So they wanted to talk about, we have a trade deficit and they're all bad. And I said, well, there are certain trade deficits that could be deleterious. So I'm not going to argue against that. But the question is this. I used, our favorite corner store with my cousins. I said, if we go up to the Zelzny's and we buy something from the corner store, we spent $100 there. Are they going to buy anything from me? I mean, no, right? That's so there's a trade deficit there. It's like, that's not something that I have to worry about, right? It's that type of thing, I think, where if we can get back to, understanding what these things are specific to, like, I agree that Citizens United was terrible for the country in every possible way, because I don't think a corporation is a person. I don't think it has anything to do with free speech. I think it has to do with putting money into politics.
Yeah, and corporate interests are not local interests.
No.
Corporate interests are shareholder interests.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, but if a factory can cut a corner to save some money, they're going to, most of the time. And if that leads to polluted drinking water or polluted air or unsafe working conditions or injured workers, those are local interests, and that corporate donation gets them out of trouble.
Well, Upton Sinclair wrote that book for a reason, right?
That's right.
The externalities of, and that didn't, I don't know if this is true or not, but I read FDR actually was somewhat touched by that book.
I've read that. I don't know if it's true.
I don't know if it's true, but The Jungle was the book we're talking about, and it had a lot to do with the meatpacking district at the time and how just unconscionable the behavior was. Of the
right, and the working conditions.
Yeah. And I don't, I do agree that the common sense needs to happen, but as, you and I, who spend a lot of our time in the world of politics, every second I see what's going on in our body politic, it drives me crazy.
Well, that's right. We're so overwhelmed right now. There's so many things that make no sense, that aren't in the long-term best interests of the country, that are paybacks for political donations. And you can't address all of them effectively. And even if you can fix one or two, 10 of them slip by you, and it just accumulates. And it is not in the national interest. We are a fantastically rich country. We can afford an awful lot. if we had some sensible tax policy, if we had some sensible immigration policy.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm waiting. Where's the U.S. Chamber of Commerce on immigration? Because you cannot tell me that the agricultural industry, construction industry, food and meat packing industries, hospitality, healthcare, all of them employ tens and tens and tens of thousands of people who are not here legally, who are law abiding. How is it in our best interest to push them out?
It's not. And I think that's the same thing if you look at a lot of the metrics specific to the Obama administration and how many deportations it had. It wasn't that they weren't removing people from the United States. It was they were doing it before they got here. So they get here and they remove them immediately. It wasn't that they were here for 10, 20 years working in jobs. And what's happening with ICE today, obviously, is a tragedy that I think is also lost in the discussions. I had this discussion with my relatives. I said, I don't think any person of reason argues that we need to have borders. I know that there's a lot of progressives out there that say there should be no borders and that we should take in every refugee. And I understand the heart behind that, but that's not possible for so many reasons. And I think that, yes, proper immigration reform. You mentioned that too in a previous interview, in that you worked for Senator Rockefeller at the time. And what year was that you were working with him?
I worked for Jay Rockefeller, let's see, 94, 95, 95, 96.
Okay. Was that Ted Kennedy was helping with that at the time?
Yep. Yeah.
So that was kind of the last time, right, that we actually almost had a deal?
So Jay Rockefeller, Democratic senator from West Virginia, former two-term governor in West Virginia. His driving passion was healthcare reform. West Virginia had, and I believe still has, the highest per capita number of military veterans in the country.
Okay.
And so it was an older, industrial, blue collar veteran population.
Yeah.
And healthcare was hard to come by outside of some of the main cities in West Virginia. And Jay wanted to push healthcare reform. And was working with Ted Kennedy, but also was working closely with Bob Dole and with David Boren from Oklahoma and a number of members. And they all agreed that there's a healthcare crisis in America, that care was too expensive, too hard to come by, too unreliable, and insurance was really not something that too many people could count on. And so they agreed there's a problem, and they started this working group to kind of resolve it. Or at least come up with ideas on how to attack the problem. And then there was an internal polling memo from the Republican National Committee. And I'll never forget that. The phrase it used was that their polling had found that that credit for healthcare reform would accrue to Democrats. And so Republicans were to oppose healthcare reform sight unseen.
Oh.
That was the exact phrase, sight unseen. And instantly, we went from, we have a problem, let's work together to figure out how to solve it, to one party saying there's no problem. And logic just doesn't stand up to logic. And and we see this constantly, whether it's with school nutrition or smoking or gun safety or whatever it is. We all know logically where we have problems and that we should figure out a way to solve it so that maybe everybody's a little happy and a little annoyed. And if everybody walks away from the final product a little happy and a little annoyed, we've probably gotten it right. Nobody should get everything they want.
Right.
That's not how democracy works. And if we live in an era where compromise is a bad word and seen as a political liability, then nothing holds us together.
Right. And that's where we are today. I mean, the only good news to that story is that it's not like it's brand new to our body politic that we have this division about Democrats and Republicans. It's existed for many years. I think the problem that I see, and you obviously have helped me understand, is that it's far more toxic today than it was in the 90s.
We always had those kind of strange bedfellow relationships, whether it was Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan or John Boehner and Barack Obama, or Ted Kennedy and Orrin Hatch from Utah.
Yeah.
And these guys, they liked each other. They could talk candidly. It didn't leak. and then they could go back and talk to their members and kind of humanize the problem, or at least, ease the contempt for the other side. And those relationships don't really exist anymore. It's considered weakness. It's considered a liability.
Yeah.
And so these guys, they don't like each other, and that's a big problem.
Do you think that there's a possibility? I've said this to my relatives in a nice way. I said, I just think that everyone needed more pain to have faith in the government again. And I don't know if,
Well,
I mean, in this sense, dude, what's going on with the Trump administration, even my relatives who voted for him are perplexed and saddened by what they see.
I fully agree with you. I fully agree that in order to reestablish some center of gravity that we can all agree we need to do better, we're going to have to all collectively feel some pain, whether it is from tariffs that will raise inflation, whether it's from immigration, whether it's from deportations that will drive up labor costs and create shortages.
When the inhumanity of it, is to people, it's driving even those people crazy.
I mean, think about this, right? I don't care what channel you're getting your news from. You every day will see a story that shows masked, armed, anonymous men in unlabeled military uniforms grabbing people off the street and disappearing them.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen in America.
Didn't.
Yeah. You have law firms and networks paying protection money.
Homage,
That doesn't happen.
That did not happen previously.
I mean, Stephen, look, I don't know whether Stephen Colbert having his show canceled is connected to the Viacom, the Paramount settlement with President Trump. I don't know. I find the timing really suspicious.
The timing is suspicious, but yeah.
And so are we in a country that instead of having late night comments mock and ridicule and make fun of our president, we now have to fear losing our broadcast license if we do that? Again, that's not this country, and that's not a democracy. And you can think Stephen Colbert is not funny. You cannot, if there's a connectivity here, you cannot like that he's going to be pushed off the air as part of that settlement.
Right.
And it's a big if, but it begs the question because it doesn't really make sense any other way.
Well, the Colbert thing is a great point for how complicated this is. I know as a media guy, and I've talked to my media friends about this, they were losing about $40 million a year. Right. So the question is, was it a halo brand for their shows? Was it good for, and it was the only thing that was working in late night? There's a lot of
it's the Marvin Cowell, Jack Benny formula.
Exactly. That's what you're saying before the news.
But I also have to believe that if this was a pure financial decision, there is some middle ground before you get to canceling the show.
Yeah.
Scale it back to 3 nights a week. Scale it back to 3 nights a week, 30 weeks a year.
Right.
There's a way to keep his voice in the public forum.
Yeah. Well, I think the bigger priest for me was CBS paying the $16 million. That was pure payoff money to Trump. The lawsuit was dog shit. You know this as well as I do. There wasn't
absolutely the lawsuit would have been laughed out of any court.
There wasn't a legal scholar that any reputation.
Paramount needed the FCC to approve its merger.
Yep.
And that was the leverage. Now, why ABC paid, to settle over George Stephanopoulos, I don't know.
I don't understand why any of that was settled. I mean, I don't know if you know who Scott Galloway is, but I listen to Professor Scott Galloway a lot, and he's a hilarious pundit, a professor at NYU marketing, and he said the same thing about this as I've shared with friends off camera, is that when Zuckerberg and Bezos and Mark Andreessen and all those cats went to kiss the ring, he said, as a businessman, you have a direct report to your shareholders and your board. And if you can go there and get more money and or less nonsense from Trump, because everyone knows that if you poke Trump, he'll poke you back as hard as he can and he'll come after you. And so I get why the networks did it, but I think to your point, I think the networks, they didn't want to lose. I think the networks, they wanted to keep the the timing's terrible. The optics are ugly.
Yeah.
It does look like fascism. It does look like we're losing the battle there. And I think that's where, for me, the common sense of our politics to me is lost. And I don't know if, and I guess that's the only silver lining to me that I see with Mr. Trump's regime, is that I think he's pushing things so far that he actually might bring people back together. And these are very anecdotal discussions that I shared with you off camera and on camera today. But most of my relatives have regret. They're pretty scared about what's going on, specifically my friends who are lacking in finances. So it's like, those are the kind of things where I do believe that we needed more pain as a culture to believe in institutions that have purpose and that expertise, to your point about the State Department, those relationships, the soft power, all the stuff that was implemented with JFK and USAID.
And all the interconnectedness, all those farmers.
It's all interconnected.
All those farmers whose crops are bought by USAID, that are packaged up and shipped to refugee camps, and I mean, that set of connected dots is very real. The dividends were very meaningful. And so, to your point, yeah, I worry that just as maybe the extremism may push us to find that common center of gravity, the institutions around us will be irreparably broken.
I think they're going to be irreparably harmed. I don't know if they're going to get obliterated. That's my hope, is that they will be harmed, but there's a generational remedy. It's not going to be quick, right? Because none of this, everything that, to your point, the JFK USAID piece, that came into soft power, and that was a reason for that. And that does work, right? And that vacuum is being filled up by Russia and China at this point. And so you're like, okay, that's...
President Clinton used to love to say, it was a quote that he I think he attributed to Averell Harriman, but I'm not sure that was the exact source. But it was that when goods move, armies don't. And it was the idea that when people have jobs and incomes and stability, and the future looks good for their children, they're not interested in picking up guns and going to war.
That's true.
And that is kind of where USAID and the State Department and an awful lot of what the U.S. government does is, I would rather send a bag of grain than have to deploy a U.S. soldier.
Yeah. Well, and that was the Marshall Plan's idea too, right? We wanted other nations to be strong so that we could share trade and cultures and prosper together. Yeah, exactly. Well, Rich, I told you I'd keep you for an hour. I kept you over an hour. I appreciate your time again. I always love your wisdom. I loved your piece on David Gergen. I'll include that link in the show notes to my listeners so they can read it for themselves. But as always, thank you. I look forward to talking with you whenever I get the chance to do so.
We'll do it again, Joey.
All right, man. I appreciate it.
Thanks, buddy.
Cheers.